Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
Julilly Kohler-Hausmann, and I am a professor of American history, and I teach at Cornell University,
Now, my
upstate
first
Ithaca, New York.
upstate Ithaca, New York, and it's the
Yes,
only Ivy that is also quasi-public.
it is. It's actually kind of a really cool. I think it's an original land grant university,
Mhm.
also, or no,
It
maybe not one
is.
of the originals,
Yeah.
right? And um, yes, and it causes much confusion for everybody. But yes, that is it is a very, I don't think there are other schools, I don't think there are any very many models of schools like that outside the Ivy League either, of kind of half public, half private.
I think UVA is a bit like that, University of Virginia, because it's the
Um,
Commonwealth of Virginia. And of course, there are lots of public schools now get most of their money not from the
yeah,
state. All right. But
yes.
yeah, and it's a great school. So other than that, I have to ask you how many times a day you need to say your name and spell it out for people till they get it
The
right.
first the first part. Um, you know what? It is rather it does cause a little bit of of confusion. I always say it's Julie with like an extra beat in the middle.
But do you ever hit people
Julilly.
over the head who want to call you Julie? There must be people who want to do that.
I don't hit them. I lovingly repeat my name. And I find the context to repeat my name again.
So, Prof. Julilly, my banal opening question always, apart from complaining about your name, is to ask you if you would share with us what's currently impeding you, dynamizing you, interesting you, preoccupying you. What's going on?
I don't think it's a banal question. I think it's quite a good question. I feel like there's so many things that are dynamizing us and impeding us right now. I don't know if there's very many people that wouldn't that aren't just plagued by what's happening just generally in the world and the news. I mean, I've never found it a totally pleasant, calming experience to open up my phone in the morning, but it's just absolutely the most intrusive that the world, I mean, intrusive in the sense of, just the world coming into your daily consciousness,
Mm,
whether it be the situation in Gaza and the Middle East, whether it be just what's happening politically, so that feels very acute for me right now, frankly, just the penetration. I'm someone who's always studied politics. Politics and history are sort of my life, and I'm what I'm always thinking about. But uh, it is a sort of unique moment for me in my own life, and for me, and there's sort of an intersection with this and my own academic project right now. But the thing that I'm sort of circling around
hmm
is a question that I don't have a good answer to, but it's a question that sort of I started thinking about in 2016 when I started my current book project, and the answer is, and the question's kind of changing as it goes, but it's a question about whether Americans, United States citizens, are are actually particularly into democracy, like whether there is sort of like an actual normative commitment, or like what is the nature of the dedication to this sort of the project of democracy in American political culture. And when I started thinking about that its seriousness in like 2015, it felt kind of perverse and scandalous, like, oh, isn't it funny if maybe after all actually the citizens of the United States really actually aren't normatively that into governing themselves? Wouldn't that be a sort of clever argument to make and to explore, and to think about in like kind of deep historical context? And it's, as you can imagine, it's taken a bit of a turn that seems less of a glib provocation um, over the last few years. Not that it ever, not that it ever not that it wasn't always a very real and open question throughout at any moment in American history. So that's what comes to my mind when I hear that question.
Mm. And of course, there are polls from around the so-called democratic world or the global north, rich countries, that show that young people have diminishing faith in many polities in democracy. And
Yeah.
there's interest in the strong man in history. So I just moved to Mexico from Spain, and I lived on a street in Spain where protest marchers of all sorts would be walking. So I saw lots of people marching for dictatorship who were
Really?
almost universally highly educated, very wealthy, children of oligarchic families that had benefited from the fascist dictatorship that was in place for 40 years through to the mid to late 70s. But it's happening in so many different countries, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's hard to think, as an American historian, you know, my lens, I think problematically, is very sort of what's happened to US institutions, what happened under this presidency, what happened under, that so my framework when I'm writing and thinking about this is very much within the US context, but I think that you're right that it almost inherently impoverishes our understanding of what's happening, to not take the more a more global
Oh, I
framework,
didn't
because there
mean
is
that.
something.
I just
No,
meant
no,
there's
but I
something
think you're
going
right.
on. Yeah.
No, I know, and that's what I'm trying to think through, because I end up sort of defaulting to sort of, but I think there is this there is this internet, this phenomenon internationally. Do you have a sense if the polling shows that it's more acute in the US? Or I mean, I haven't looked super closely at what the polling.
No, well, the polls that I've seen, many which come from Pew, the charitable
Yeah.
groups that do all kinds of really interesting socio-economic political polling, indicate that it's really strong. It's very strong here in Latin America, where,
Okay.
pretty much everywhere is now at least technically a democracy. And there are some
Mhm.
countries that at least technically have been democracies for over a century. It's very acute here, but there's a lot of it in Central Europe, Western Europe. It's big. In terms of the research you've been doing for the last 10 years, what are some of the sources you've been going to? How are you tracking this back over time in the US context?
So so I'll back up and say just a little bit about what the topic is, and then I think
Yeah,
that might help. Like,
yeah,
and then
great.
I'd love to talk about the sources because it's actually a big challenge. It's something that I'd love to get your thoughts on. But so the project, as it's kind of currently conceived, is a sort of history of American democracy after 1965, which is the year of the Voting Rights Act, and um, and in popular discourse, it's kind of the moment, at least for much of my adult life, that people sort of close the book on questions about American democracy, in the sense that when I say close the book, but obviously no one would ever say democracy isn't an issue, or certainly few historians would say that. But the sort of, I think most people would say a sort of democratization is a kind of completed project with the end of Jim Crow and and the fall of these kind of what were maybe not explicit, but were, in effect, racial bars to voting uh, in the South, particularly. Um, and so there's this way in which, at least my experience with it, there was this way in which, like, the sort of story of American democracy, kind of as a story in itself, sort of closed in 65, and then in 2000 or in 2016 or in 2008, depending on where you think the kind of contemporary crisis, I'm putting that in air quotes because uh, uh, like when people date that, there is this sort of space between, this pole that is often imagined as like a completion, like America finally aligned their democratic ideals, the creedal narrative that was of the founding. Finally, the nation sort of makes good on its promise. Everything's kind of actualized. Sure, there's some wrinkles, but this is sort of a very, you could kind of insert sections of like a Barack Obama speech here, like we're sort of the perfection, the kind of the arc of the nation bending towards, towards justice. And I think that's sort of the way that for lots of good reasons, people, thought about 1965. And so then I was thinking, so my interest came in trying to understand how we get from this moment, when people sort of assume that the sort of fundamental questions of American democracy are settled, to a moment in the 21st century where sort of both parties are saying democracy is fundamentally uh, under siege, for different reasons, but that both kind of across the political spectrum, there's kind of a consensus. There's an existential threat to America, to the American project. So my fascination, my curiosity sort of started in like, how do we make sense of this interregnum? I mean, this period, which I think obviously this is, you don't need a sophisticated history degree to say that, it connects these two periods. Do we imagine? I think a really popular way of understanding it is like sort of like, well, it was Trump, or it was Barack Obama's election, or it was, the Supreme Court doing something in 2000. But a lot of, I think, sort of popular analyses really sort of focused on things that happened right in, around kind of 2000 and after. And I am the last person who's going to say that there aren't really significant things that happened in that period. But I was sort of interested in that middle period. So that's a little bit of a long walk to get to your question. But so what I was interested in is like, can I find places where where were the struggles over American democracy sort of in this period when they had to narrate themselves as not necessarily explicit struggles over like democracy, yes or no, or democracy up or down, so there are all these fights that actually did happen in that period, where again, where I think we can really find some deep historical legacies to a lot of the contemporary struggles that we see today. And so what I've been looking at is particularly struggles over non-voters, like places where the nation, different configurations of the nation struggled over defining, first of all, who could and should be a voter. There actually were a lot of struggles that continued into this period, like who did have a right to have voice in the polity. And then also it turns out there was deep anxiety throughout this period about the fact that almost half the country chose not to vote, in any, in presidential elections, and far less in, non-presidential elections. So basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at all of these places, I'm really just trying to find texture of places where people are
Mm.
talking about their sort of like what they think is good, is democracy, like who gets a say? What should we control? Trying to find, I'm not really obsessed with the sort of intricacies of registration reform, voter registration reform, but it turns out that when you see these things fought out, that these are places where people will start fighting over the kind of, some sort of normative claims about democracy. And so anyway, so the project is looking at looking at battles over. There was many efforts throughout this period to make it easier to register to vote. United States is one of the few democracies that actually requires voter registration, that makes voting a two-step process where you have to register and then also sign up to the polls, which many people think is a big part of why, is one of the main reasons we have such a lower participation rates. So there were efforts throughout this whole period to remedy that, to sort of make registration easier. So I've used those sources um, of kind of congressional debates and and media debates over whether or not, I mean, you kind of wouldn't think that it would be a big debate over whether or not it should be easier to register, but it turns out it was a place where there was major debating, and it's also a place where you see, I think, a long history. You see part of the deep history of the voter fraud um, issue that we see so saliently today, because voter fraud. It turns out that voter fraud has like kind of a deep, long deep history in American history. throughout American history as a really salient kind of issue in American politics. But it turns out that it, was also really an issue in these registration fights, for instance. So I'm also looking at issues like court battles over felon disenfranchisement, which was persevered during this period, and um, other things that we could talk about more too. But it's sort of a combination um, of a fair amount of stuff on actual congressional and local fights that persevered, that really did continue to be kind of about the texture of democratic representation in the country.
Yes, that wonderful concept, the civilly dead, civiliter mortuus, that has been handed down to us regrettably. I think 1965 is also an interesting point of departure because in addition to what gets spoken about a lot, that group of reforms that Johnson was able to shepherd through because he knew how to corral Dixiecrats.
Exactly.
It's also when immigration policy changes. And of course, it's the annus mirabilis horribilis in the meretricious Bowling Alone book by Robert Putnam. It's the last moment in which people just get along and wonderful suburban life sees people be charitable and civil society is real in the United States. In other words, it's a white world with a reasonably thriving industrial working class, and no one thinks about the agricultural working class of white people, and no one thinks about African Americans, and Latinos are counted and Latinas as white. And then suddenly, when the preferential immigration for people like me is concluded, miraculously, Putnam's utopia is destroyed. So I do think race is a crucial part of this, not just in the traditional US sense, slavery, African Americans not counting even afterwards as 100% citizens, Asian Exclusion Act, all those other things, but actually those public policies, the end of the guest worker program, the Bracero program for Mexicans.
Absolutely critical.
These
Yeah.
things are really significant, it seems to me, in changing the racial, cultural hue of the United States and eventually leading in part to the breakup of the Dixiecrat coalition with progressive, middle-class, educated, Northern and Midwestern Democrats.
No, it's so I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the things that's like outstanding outstanding in the sense that it's one of the things I want to do a lot more work on is understanding it's probably not worth getting into, but there's a really critical immigration story, and what happens post 65 and how, um, like, I'm kind of tempted not to get all the way into it, but it's so important.
Please do.
One of the really interesting things for me, um, about the political science debates this is now just sort of on the turnout side question. Um, and so throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was this huge debate, like, where are the vanishing voters? Where's everybody going? Like, what's happening? Why is American turnout? Maybe, we finally actualized the American vision. We have an inclusive multiracial democracy. Like, why, like, this is the narrative. And why suddenly is faith in government plummeting, turnout plummeting, like, what's happening? And and there's a part of the story that I think is actually more important, which I think is what you're really pointing to, which is what happens when the polity really grapples with what it means to produce a multiracial citizenship. Like, when you really try yet again to kind of crack this kind of ethno-national understanding, of the nation. And it's very impervious, it's a very strong and profound and persistent identity. And there's profound resistance to cracking that. And I think that's in some ways the more important conversation, but I want to pivot really quickly back to this sort of issue with the political scientists. So the political scientists were always sort of having a mystery about like, why is there this turnout? Is it because we enfranchise 18-year-olds, and then young people always vote less, so that's why why this trend line is going down? Is it because the boomers are so great and the boomers are where they're or something about that? Um, and and then someone comes in and says, "Oh, here's your problem." This is a political scientist, I respect this intervention from the perspective of like a statistical intervention, but I think it's really telling, sort of from a sort of theoretical standpoint. So someone comes in and says, "You guys are so anxious about all this declining turnout, but you've been," and this is a little bit tricky, but like you've been focusing on the voting age population, everybody who is above 18, and the declining percentage of the people that are above 18 that have been voting. Yeah, that looks like it's going down really dramatically, and that's so bad. But do you know what you haven't done? You forgot to take out all the people that are ineligible to vote that are living in this country. And if you take out all the immigrants, all the and all the felons, all of these huge, it actually doesn't look that bad. Like we really didn't have that much of a decline in voting. And we need to stop like wringing our hand, like maybe people should stop getting so anxious about this decline in voting, because it's really just this artifact of just the fact that there's all of these people living in the country who, who are totally just ineligible to vote, meaning that and really what that comes down to is a dramatic increase in the number of people because of these reforms that you mentioned in 1965. It's part of it is it's an after effect of all these people that are living, like new immigrants living in the country without that don't have legal that aren't able to vote, whether that be because they're not documented or because they're on green card or some of their status. But if you think about it, it's really a fascinating thing to say about the polity, right? Which is, it's like, oh no, it's actually not a problem. We just have like quadruple the number of people disenfranchised, technically civilly dead, because of a felony, which is of course like a highly racialized process. I mean, obviously, I mean, maybe not obviously, but I think most people understand mass incarceration to be, like a profoundly racialized process, and it's just a sort of great, so I'm going through all that just to say it's like even our fundamental sort of debates, like the fact that we would think that we've sort of normalized living in a polity with it's such a huge population of people that have a status, there were that where they're, whether it be people, people that are immigrants with green cards that are, that have no sort of political representation. Which is not to say that all those people want to be citizens. I'm sure many of them actually don't want to be, don't want to be citizens, but we do, there's a deep history in America of what's called alien voting, where people enfranchise where there's an enfranchisement of, of non-citizens. So it's not as if, I think, I don't know the intricacies, but, the EU handles this differently, if you live in different places where you're not, from. So anyway, I do think, so that's a long way of saying there's just no question that immigration and citizenship and race are at the kind of center of any discussions of trying to understand the sort of anxieties about democracy in
Well,
in the 20th century.
this brings me back, as it were, to your first book, Getting Tough, because that is about the carceral state in its second belligerent coming.
Yeah.
Also, how that ties into welfare and the discourse of welfare, because this is another thing that really gets moving under the so-called Great Society. The Great Society that was first coined as an expression during the First World War, but really gets picked up by the Johnson administration and becomes a tool to attack particularly African Americans by the late 60s, if not earlier. So could you take us back a bit to your very and justly celebrated first volume. And tell us a little bit about that, because it does seem to me there are some links to this project.
Yeah, they really they grow out of, yeah, kind of, because it's always the case. One grew out of the other. Um, so the first project was an effort to make sense of the relationship between the burgeoning penal system and the sort of evisceration of the American welfare state, and trying to sort of go beyond. Um, so there had been a temptation, at least in my field, there had been a tendency, not temptation, tendency to sort of, there were a lot of histories about of the welfare state, and then there were a lot of histories. And actually, when I started writing that book, there really weren't that many histories about of the penal system or of the carceral state. Now there's just been an incredible, beautiful effervescence of that work, which is really important. It's just been an honor to be part of, frankly, and to tend to watch develop. But so when I started the book, I was trying to understand kind of in the historical grounded sites, like how those dynamics related to each other, and and what was happening, that would lead, like what were the sort of factors that led the nation to kind of embrace. Eventually came to believe, like, really sort of embrace. My God, my cat just walked across the
Oh,
screen.
you've got an orange one.
Yes, he's very big
You
and
know,
fat.
85% of orange cats are male.
Oh, that's interesting because we have two and they're both male.
There's a genetic weirdness. Mr. O is
Do you have
asleep over there.
you have one too?
Mr. O?
Oh, that's very adorable. See, I have two cats during our conversation here, so you'll be maybe
Oh.
lucky to get the other one here. Um, but anyway, so yeah, that's what the first project was. It looked at a bunch of places in the 1970s, which, I think we're right. A lot of us sort of tend to see the 70s as a real pivotal point where the kind of crises of the 1960s kind of like there was a long temptation to think that the 60s was where everything happened, and then there were books that were like the decade nothing happened, but I think maybe because we're trying to get some job security, but a lot of us have sort of really been focusing on the 70s as a period when the when things really kind of crashed and had to be negotiated through. And so my book looked at a couple of places where, for instance, the Rockefeller drug laws, the passage of the Rockefeller drug laws, which are sort of understood as the kind of opening salvo in the war on drugs, where these laws were passed, and kind of the fights over embracing this punitive approach to social problems, and the role that had in discrediting the welfare state. So I ended up basically arguing that these weren't just two phenomenon that kind of happened because neoliberalism demanded it, but that they were actually intimately connected, and that the building of the carceral state and the expansion of the penal system was also actually instrumental in discrediting a sort of more universal social citizenship vision, right? That you need that it wasn't just that. I mean, it wasn't just that there was a kind of get tough logic and this is how we were going to handle crime, but that in part through all this kind of punitive policy making and this kind of frenzy of punishment, part of what that was doing was actually discrediting the idea that the state, for instance, could could offer could offer social goods, in a way that would create sort of a floor in citizenship. So, I mean, I could talk more. I'd be happy to talk more about that, but as you can probably imagine, I could talk a lot about it in my book because I spent many years of my life working on it.
Could I ask you
Yeah.
to focus on one thing, which was very powerful when I lived many times in the United States, but when I first arrived there as a full-time resident and worker, the figure of the welfare queen, so-called,
Yeah.
was in full flow. And it's something that you've been concerned with in some of your work. For those who've come to the story later or not come to the story, could you explain how that operated and its elements of racism and misogyny as a rhetoric?
Yes. Um, so for people who, in case it's funny because whenever I teach this these days, often my students aren't familiar with the welfare queen, which 15 years ago you could say it in any room, right, and everybody would know. Although some of them have heard of the food stamp king, which I think maybe was floating around the other.
Oh, I didn't
Um,
know that
eh,
one. I love it. Like
yeah,
the guy who's
and
buying a pack
now
of Marlboro and some Coca-Cola with welfare.
traditionally it's the lobster tail. Like the idea
Oh,
is that he's buying a lobster tail at the grocery store. That's the one that they were really circulating for a while. Now we have the most modern incarnation. This might be a good way of actually backing into it. The modern incarnation, if people are following U.S. politics, that, or I think the legacy of the welfare queen, where you can see it the most explicitly, is the debates recently over Medicaid and cutting Medicaid, and the idea that there's a bunch of now it's a bunch of 20-year-olds on their parents' couches playing video games and they're just sort of slacking off and they're getting Medicaid and they're not working and they're getting Medicaid and the sort of and that's a really powerful animation. I mean, that's really animating the efforts to implement work requirements on Medicaid. So anyway, so that's the kind of current day incarnation of the welfare queen. But the welfare queen was an obsession, sort of most. I mean, do you associate with Ronald Reagan, or was that something? Because
oh, interesting. I associate it with the R word, as in his evil political party,
okay, yeah,
the party of Lincoln.
the Party of Lincoln, yes, very.
I associate it with the R word. I associate it with the attack on welfare, but I think of it also as Bush Senior and Clinton.
Yeah, well, they all, yeah. So the welfare queen was actually born in the mid 70s. This is again, it's always we just get to
Oh,
like deliver on the 70s over and over again.
okay. Okay.
And it came out of this so in the 70s it's actually it is a really it's a great example of sort of this punitive turn story that I think
Hmm.
is really important, which is so basically civil like welfare rights movements, civil rights movements, Black freedom movement was really attacked the racist the sort of racist administration of welfare, meaning so you could get camp, like so for generations you couldn't get cash welfare. There's lots of it's we don't need to get into it, but there's lots of sort of bureaucratic mechanisms that made it that were used to keep particularly Black women off the welfare rolls. They would search their homes, suitable home requirements. There was there had a lot of local discretion. So like like local Southerners could kind of choose, like were able to sort of decide who got access to welfare. This happened to a large degree in the North too. So in the 60s and early 70s, a lot of these things were attacked and dismantled via like court cases, but really all credit needs to go to it was really catalyzed by the civil rights movement and the welfare rights movement. So all of a sudden, all of these people who had previously been kind of not kind of been kept out of the welfare rolls, all of a sudden are claiming state benefits that they were 100% qualified and for in the sense of financially, like they were poor
Hmm.
enough to have this benefit. And so states were kind of panicked, again in the 70s and all the crises of, we can go into the crises of the economy and all this. So economic insecurity and displacement is increasing just as people who traditionally the state had been able to kind of keep off the rolls were suddenly actually getting legal access to the rolls. So suddenly the cost of welfare is like exploding and states are left just some of them are like, okay, we're delivering goods to what people that deserve them. Other states start trying to find ways to shore their roles. Um, and at the same time, there's deep anxiety about Black citizens getting access to markers of full citizenship. I mean, welfare has always been a subordinated project, but the extent to which any state policy like reaffirms and asserts full citizenship of of Black citizens, that also is going to have sort of a political valence too, right? So basically, what happened is there was a story in I'm laughing because it's actually really a bonkers story, but there's this story kind of exploded in the 70s about a woman who supposedly was getting welfare benefits from multiple offices, who was going around and they called her the welfare queen. And she supposedly was getting benefits from like she was supposedly getting benefits. I mean, the numbers just fluctuated wildly. Like she had 300 aliases, or I don't know, she had 25 aliases. She had three husbands. She had all these wigs, and she was going around office to office and collecting welfare benefits from from everybody.
It sounds
And
like
this is
how I
evidence.
try to get jobs.
Exactly. We just put on a different wig and we're like, please hire me now. Yes. Well, anyway, you'll be interested to hear that there's an interesting link between the obsession with welfare fraud and voting fraud, but that's another thing. But anyway, so this obsession with this woman became pretense to say, okay, all of these people on welfare are actually unworthy, like they're lying about they actually aren't poor. They're driving around in Cadillacs. It's all a fraud, So it's this discourse of kind of undeservingness, needing this shot through with kind of racial pretense, that a woman that an African American woman would sort of stay home and do the child giving labor in itself was already a kind of cultural anathema, like there was a lot of people that you could activate racist sentiments just by the prospect of a woman being allowed to raise her own children, um and not have to work for that job. There's that the white women had been afforded that. A lot of white women culturally were enabled, were allowed to do that, but the idea that black women would have that right, obviously was part of this whole mix. So anyway, Ronald Reagan fixates on this story of this woman in Illinois, a story that they're using to try to cut rolls and try to sort of increase surveillance on the welfare population in Illinois. Ronald Reagan tells this story about the welfare queen at like every stop in his 1976 presidential run. I mean, he really catapults the story of kind of an individual cheater, um, and a woman like an undeserving, lazy, not working, not financially insecure, like a very financially comfortable woman. That's the prototypical welfare recipient. That's sort of the story that he helps kind of nationalize. Um, and but then I think that by the time it gets to you, it becomes sort of I think, but you tell me if I'm wrong. It becomes less a story about this one individual, like really intensely fascinating fraudster, who, by the way, everyone thinks that she actually was a total fabrication of Reagan's mind. And he did sometimes get stories a little quite wrong. But in this case, this woman actually existed. Um, but but in time, through political culture and multiple tellings, the welfare queen becomes much more the sort of prototype for all kind of undeserving welfare recipients. Would you say, the idea of someone who's culturally, who's lazy, sitting on a bed, eating bonbons, not really working, that was the narrative.
This
And
is
it was, and
sounding more and more like me with every quasi
I mean,
anecdote you share with us.
I know it's like I mean, I think you could do some sort of Freudian stuff. Like this is actually what all of us really want, is just to be able to have a Cadillac, eat bonbons, and like have the state. Like, why can't we just sit at home and like do what we want? But yes, but it becomes this narrative that legitimizes and that authorizes not only cuts to the welfare program, but incredible surveillance and criminalization of poor women on welfare, and I would say poor people just in general. The idea, welfare recipients are sort of almost held responsible for crime at a certain point. The idea that you're sort of that pathological mothers are what produce, there's sort of cultural scripts that run that way. So anyway, a long way of saying, I think there's this really fascinating history of the politics of fraud and cheating and trickiness being a technique, I don't know if it's like a deliberate technique, but being a technology of sort of undermining broader state programs. I mean, you see this now with Elon Musk and an obsession with, like Doge cutting down on fraud and waste, and there's a way in which narratives of welfare fraud and of voting fraud and of um, Medicaid fraud, and are really instrumental in undermining the state, undermining the state altogether. So that's that's the welfare queen. Does that sound familiar at all to the way that you
Oh,
experienced it in
absolutely,
the?
absolutely. But not as familiar as someone getting their tummy tickled.
I know this guy's my kitty's getting.
They are so adorable. Yes, absolutely. And that's definitely where I came in. And perhaps somewhere I read that there was a Fonzette Origo of the Welfare Queen, but I didn't realize it was as, in inverted commas, rich a story as you've just shared with me. But this certainly has a lot in common with what continues to be the dominant discourse of the right in Britain about welfare, which is getting something for nothing.
Yes.
Photographs of people looking out through their curtains at 2 in the afternoon when it's been proven that no one in that house has worked for years and years and so on. This is an absolute obsession. It's not completely racialized there. It's about class as much as anything, but it does connect when that involves immigrants.
Mhm. Yeah.
Immigrants,
Well,
in commas, legal or otherwise, should not be getting these benefits. That's a big thing
well,
there.
that's exactly where um that's exactly the bridge between the two projects for me, interestingly.
Mm,
Um, which I'll say one word about in a second, but I do want to back up and say the most fascinating thing about that story about the original Linda Taylor is that if you think about this as the woman that sort of catalyzed, that is like the kind of it becomes sort of the prototypical welfare recipient and negative, undeserving welfare recipient, and sort of is pulled through all of these debates for to this day. Um, the deep irony is she is a person that existed. And not only did she engage in incredible fraud against the welfare state, they did, but it turns out she also was like the least typical welfare state. I mean, she was probably also maybe a murderer. She had been, it was like welfare fraud was like the least significant crime she was involved in. Turned out she showed up like a numbers runner, died in Chicago with like $100,000 of cash in his. I might have some of the exact details around, but like someone died in Chicago and she showed up and pretended to be his niece. I mean, she was just a complete. She probably had some sort of serious emotional problems. You know, I mean, so I don't want to like be like kind of ridicule her or anything, but the point is this woman, the last thing that she was a prototypical welfare recipient. And so and I mean, and someone has gone, I didn't do this work, but there's a journalist that went in and did like a deep dive on her life, and found out that she maybe like kidnapped a baby. I mean, just like really wild. I don't have all the details because I'm not that interested in this crazy titillating story about this like real crime story, but it's fascinating that she ends up being, the last person you should take as being an average welfare recipient. Um, but anyway, so to pivot back to this, where I said there was the bridge, is what I became so fascinated about in this period. And it's interesting to hear that you see this. I'd be interested in how you see if you see this happening in Britain. Is it became very clear that in a period of time that talked about it like that, where the nation talked about itself as a place that has like an increasingly sort of universal and robust equal citizenship. These debates, whether it be about immigration, whether it be about welfare, whether it be about crime, you see, I think, the persistence of a tradition where citizenship and standing in the polity is earned, and you have to prove, what I mean, where it's not where you have to like prove your standing in society. There was a time where that had to be done through whiteness. There was a explicitly moral character, and you can sort of tell one version of American history where you just are sort of renegotiating the criteria for full standing and citizenship. And I think that what you see through these debates, the welfare debates, the crime debates, and I'd be interested in what you think, is that that there really is this like precarity at the center of American citizenship, of American understandings of American citizenship, where if you didn't work, that or then that really did put into work. I'm putting in quotes because it's like that's obvious. Who's working and what work is of course a totally culturally constructed idea. Um, but just standing in the polity. Um, is quite contingent, and quite conditional. Um, and so anyway, so that's the bridge. Can you sort of where I started wondering about kind
Yes,
of
I think
democracy
I think I understand that better in the US than the UK context, because I remember being puzzled by the fact that in the United States there's a powerful and seemingly important distinction between personality and character,
Hmm,
terms that I always thought of as synonymous, but I came to see that they were thought of differently. And the figure who incarnated this for me was what the Mexicans called George W. Bush, because he was supposed to have this completely fucked up personality, drunk, childish, rebellious,
yeah,
do nothing, care nothing. But he had overcome all of that because he had developed character. And as I was trying to make sense of this, when I was endeavoring to comprehend the US polity between about 2000 and 2006, I came to see more and more discussion of character as how you had molded yourself to be better than you might originally have been in terms of whatever it might be, your genes,
mhm.
your upbringing, your socioeconomic circumstances. It's a real obsession in the United States until
Interesting.
you get to Donald J. Trump, when it ceases to matter. All that matters is having made money and been on television and having an orange comb over. So all
Although maybe though, in some ways, sufficient money is always a kind of a kind of pass for character. I mean, I think you're using character in a more, but I'm wondering if just power and money at a certain point become.
could be. When I became a US citizen, Prof, one of the questions I had to answer, among many questions where the answers given by the US government were incorrect, for example, which countries won the Second World War? The only correct answers are America, somewhere called England, and somewhere called France, which last I looked at was sending off Jews in boarded up trains to death. And of course, I said to my immigration attorney, what about 25 million and counting Soviet citizens? Shut the
I was
fuck
about
up.
to
Do
say.
you want to become a citizen or don't you? Another great question was, what was Dwight D. Eisenhower before he became president of the United States? Well, the correct answer is he was president of Columbia University.
Yeah.
That's the real answer. But the correct answer for the
Oh,
United
they
States, Supreme Allied Commander of the forces in Western Europe during World War II. And yes, I do think that having that sort of background is key. And being born in Hawaii in 1962 just doesn't cut it for those people.
and obviously, yeah. I mean, and there's always this sort of obfuscation, or there was. I mean, this is where it's interesting. Recently, the conversations have gotten on the much more explicit about the fact that it, for years as historians we were like, look, there's still this ethno-nationalism. I mean, I found it, I dug it up and let the I like, I promise, still people, there are people still, there's still this commitment to sort of white nation, and 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 now it's just not, we don't have any fun anymore because people are just like, by the way, this should be an Anglo-Christian nation. And I mean, people are really, quite explicitly saying some of these things, and which I don't think that's a positive development, but I think at least there's a sort of some forthright, I mean,
Recognition. Prof, I know
there's
you
some
have to
forthrightness.
go. You have another commitment. I had one more question for you, which is
Yes.
actually probably a difficult one because it might
Yeah.
might be long in the answer. But if there's time, I'd also like to allow you, as it were, the opportunity to mention anything we haven't mentioned that's on your mind. So my question is, it seems to me that right now there's a profound anti-Semitism in the United States that operates by ferreting out and identifying what are supposed to be anti-Semitic tendencies in, and I've never seen anything like it. Am I right in thinking that?
It it's it is sort of astounding that you can have a conversation where people will call groups of Jewish activists anti-Semitic, or say that. I mean, I don't. It is a really astounding like the discourse that's happened. I mean, there's so many things to like kind of grapple with here, but there is something really profound and astounding about saying, being very concerned about anti-Semitism, which I think we all should be, um, but saying, in the same light of saying that you're concerned about anti-Semitism, speaking as if all Jewish people should have one voice or one opinion is to me sort of the definition of when you're using kind of racial, ethnic, and religious stereotypes, and so it does feel like you're through the look. I mean, like everything, it feels like you're pretty through the looking glass, on these issues. um but it's sort of like some of the issues on, sometimes on these conversations about democracy or all these things, it is always a really hard question, like how much do you need to drill, like how much should we be taking people's discourse seriously on face value? And I mean, we have to, I think, especially as academics, to take the discourse seriously on face value, but if we were just doing logical, like logical reasoning, a lot of these things don't quite stake out.
And
um,
Dr. Lily, before you race off, is there anything that we've touched on that you'd like to revisit, or something we haven't discussed that you'd like to speak about?
I mean, there's so many things I kind of would keep on just talking. I want to hear more about what your take on all this is. Um, the only thing that I was just, I don't know, I don't really need to say this, but I'll just say, just kind of close a loop that's open in my mind, which is when you were talking about character, the thing that made me think about is when I was thinking about the difference between Britain and England and the US. um, I was thinking about felon disenfranchisement, because in the US, we so I, I sometimes wonder, like, how different really are these different political cultures? Like, as an American historian, I tend to, I think, probably just be like, I'm just very focused within the U.S. But but you say there's all these other trends that are happening in other places. But when I think about the uniqueness of a political culture that is okay with just saying these group of citizens with one act, assuming that they fully committed that, whatever. But let's just assume it was a horrible act, that nullifies your standing in the polity. That is a really profound, I think, statement on the entire understanding of what it means to be to be a society and to be governing ourselves. And I wonder if you think that relates at all to the question of character, because I think the rationale for felon disenfranchisement, of course, is that criminals will, quote, pollute the civic body. That's one understanding. And then the other understanding and rationale is that you sort of by committing a crime, you forfeit your right to have voice in the polity. But both are kind of sort of premised on the idea that if you have a bad character, that the state should be screening at some level for character, and that character is something that affects whether you should have voice. And I'm just wondering if do you see those things as connected to the way you were thinking about character, or does that seem
Oh,
kind of
absolutely.
askance?
Absolutely. And especially, I think, when applied to political candidates,
Yeah.
and also as applied to people who engage in the seemingly random killing of others. So
Yeah.
one of the things that's done when there are mass killings, which is every week in the United States, is that the person's character is assessed. So
Yeah.
it's puzzling if they were in the military. It's puzzling if they were Christian.
Hmm.
It's puzzling if they were students. In other words, it's puzzling if they're part of what are deemed to be decent institutions with correct line ideologies. There's nothing raised normally about race, and especially gender and sexuality, which are key points in the world of integers of US society. Who does this all the time? White men, all the time. I don't need to tell you that. This is not discussed. Instead, these institutions that are looked for intimately and instantly, that are the puzzles. He was in the military. He was a churchgoer, blah, blah, blah. And if the answers aren't found there, in other words, if they're not in those institutions, then the answers are found on what they did with the popular media.
Yeah.
It used to
There's
be
yes.
what the videos were that they watched. Now it's what they're doing online, right? So these points of identifying character get associated with the institutions one's affiliated with, right?
Hmm.
And also with these external influences that drive you mad. This is done again and again and again in place of engaging sexual and racial politics. And it seems to me that at these limit cases of being a big time politician, being a big time murderer, this character obsession really expresses itself. By the way, you have a little person sitting just behind you who wants some attention, I think.
Oh, this kitty is back again. He was just he's
So
this
that's
is
my, for what
he's
it's worth, that's my take on it, that you can see it in these limit cases, this obsession with character. And I think that that's where your brilliant nexus, perhaps it's well hewn now, but to me it was new through your work of
Mm,
discourse of welfare, discourse of incarceration as forms of disenfranchising citizens can really be seen put together very powerfully.
mhm.
And again, it's about what are deemed to be limit cases, right?
Exactly. And I think I think that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the limit cases as like the it's so true. The president, is actually on the others sort of our authorities are sort of the other side of the limit case. That's really interesting. But I think they in both cases they show that that there is really yes, that like I think crime and welfare, crime and people on state assistance are also cases where you can really see the rubber hitting the road and the state, I mean, and kind of political culture really trying to negotiate and meaning make, like what like this is where you see and it's where you see like, yeah, I think you're right, deep, profound anxiety about, well, these institutions have to make good, I mean, like have to make sort of good people. And then of course there's none of that anxiety when there's much less of that anxiety when the people committing violent crimes are not sort of understood as kind of a surprise, as like the surprising crime. And there's a whole way in which violent crime is naturalized in other spaces and racial groups, and doesn't get any of the same consternation and kind of hand wringing, which again, I think we should be hand wringing all violent crime. I'm not, I think these are not things that, we should normalize, but it is profoundly different how the society kind of wrestles with and makes meaning from different, from these different cases. Um, and yeah, I am very grateful to you to being able to like have this conversation because I'm like kind of dreading the semester starting and getting my mind back in gear, and this makes me feel like there's fun conversations to be had about work. So,
Well, I'm one of your students, as it were, Prof. Julilly. Thank you so much for being with us. It was wonderful to learn from you today.
thank you so much. This is such a great project that you managed to do on top of all the other millions of books you're writing and everything else that you're doing. So, thank you for having me.